Good afternoon and welcome to this week's edition of 2-Minute Warning, where each week we take a deeper dive into some of the issues that are pressing on the climate change agenda, that are the must-do, no longer can delay list. And that list, unfortunately, is very long. But we're here this week with Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, CEO of Lanzatech. Dr. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure, Sean. Thank you for having me.
If I was to say 2021, besides all of the drama of obviously the COVID pandemic, the biggest word early of the year 21 seemed to be all things to do with hydrogen, and hydrogen being the sort of breakthrough technology. This year, it feels like the big sort of buzzword in the sort of climate challenge is decarbonization. And every connotation of what that means. What's your sort of general headline view on how we're doing in the approach to decarbonization?
It's a journey. We're just at the very beginning. I think we've got a long, long way to go. I do believe, though, that all of the new technologies and approaches that are being scaled right now will have an impact, but I think we're 5 to 10 years from that.
And from the point of view of what would be, given the sort of acceleration of emphasis on decarbonization coming out of COP26 in Glasgow last November, the sort of the big win, if you like, or the sort of low-hanging fruit revolves around the decarbonization of infrastructure and the production process. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, where are the sort of best in class examples where maybe not so?
No, actually, that's a great question. Actually, one of the most interesting things about Glasgow is the commitment to decarbonize heavy industry. I think a real realization that heavy industry, we're talking cement and steel and refining, all need to decarbonize quickly. And commitments being made across industry, across the world to commit. And I've seen tremendous progress in cement and steel, where companies are working very, very hard to reduce their carbon footprint, either by capturing carbon and working with others to bury it, carbon capture and sequestration, or actually utilize it. New ways of making steel that allow you not to have the same carbon footprint, bolt-on technologies like ours that can be put on the back end of a steel mill to reduce its carbon emissions. I'm seeing a lot of that and a lot of real progress. What's most interesting is a lot of these solutions are at scale. They're not just ideas, and that's actually important. It bodes well for what the next 5 years will look like in terms of decarbonizing these heavy industrial sectors.
Just on that point, Jennifer, coming out of COP26, there was a great sense of momentum and optimism that sort of 5-year horizon that you just referenced was tangible and achievable. Now, only 6-8 months later, it feels like the world has changed quite dramatically, mostly triggered by Russia's war in Ukraine and towards energy security. I'm wondering your own thoughts on that momentum and that 5-year horizon, your thoughts on whether, is it getting derailed? Is we need to think 10 years, not 5 years? What's your sense 6-8 months after COP26?
Well, so first of all, I think it's extremely important for us to think in aggressive 5-year chunks. I don't think saying 10 years is good, because the reason that optimism goes to sometimes a lack of hope is realizing how hard it is to meet these numbers in 5 years. So if we don't focus on 5 years, we won't realize how far off we are. That for me is the first point. I think part of the problem we have, and you brought up the Ukraine war in particular and energy security, is that we go through these cycles with fossil carbon every few years. In 1979, I remember having to have to stand in line at a gas station because they were rationing gasoline because of, at the time, the first oil crisis. We have these crises all the time. At some point, we're just going to have to stand up and say, we're not going to let the foot off the pedal when the crisis ends, right? When this war ends or that ends or this embargo ends, we're going to still go fast towards a world where we are no longer using carbon that comes directly from the ground, using it once and dumping it into the air or dumping it into our oceans. This realization, this putting your head down and pushing forward, even when conditions get good, is what we need. And that's what we run into this time, right? Should it be shocking we have an energy security problem? No.
No. We have an energy security problem all the time, it appears, and certainly given the use of carbon and its impact on the planet. One of the sort of pre-COVID and coming into the COVID window was Saudi Arabia hosting the G20 presidency, in which they identified the carbon circular economy as their sort of principal kind of project commitment in order to get sort of the whole of the G20 countries, the 20 richest countries in the world, committed to this concept. I'm wondering, 2 years out from that, your thoughts on what impact that had, what's the sort of legacy outcome from it, where are we with the circular carbon economy?
Well, first of all, people are talking about it and trying to think about how to create it, right? So that's already the first step, right? Is a real recognition. I have seen tremendous progress in the use of what used to be called waste resources, a future where there is no such thing as waste, where waste is the feedstock, this true circular economy approach. In the past 5 years, the intensity has really grown. I think the declaration and the leadership shown by Saudi Arabia a few years ago in that regard is important. Continued focus in this area across the world. I hope we don't take any steps back. I believe that what is starting to be concerning is a gap, people realizing that a circular carbon economy creates a much more expensive solution today than existing resources. And I worry that all this talk of inflation and other things may cause that to step back. But I'm really excited about a future where there is no such thing as waste. And this was a first key step, is for Saudi Arabia to lead in the discussion.
When you think of that point, I mean, the carbon circular economy, one of the astonishing things, it seems to me, and I welcome your thoughts on, is how slow we have progressed in the carbon capture storage, carbon capture sequestration, given that there seems to be an economic opportunity there. Where is the technology? What's lacking? Why is that what appears to an amateur like myself like a no-brainer? Why is that not moving with more pace?
Well, I think there's two elements. One is, I think that technology deploys exponentially, right? And it's very important to get the first commercial plants up and running, and then you get into that doubling rate. If the technology makes sense, it will go into the doubling rate. I think that technologies that are part of a carbon circular economy, or that are carbon captured and transformation at a very early stage, many of them are emerging, many of them are already commercial, but nonetheless, we need to get to that doubling time. And that's what's going to happen. If you remember with solar, I remember in 2010, which is not that long ago, we were all making fun about the economics of solar, right? Oh my God, solar will always be 10 years out. You can't turn around now without seeing a solar installation, right? So it reached its doubling rate. And as it doubles, it came down in cost. That's why I think we're not seeing more. I would give it 3 to 5 years. I think you're going to see much more circular carbon projects and so on and so forth. And to continue along those veins, I think we have to always remember and creating products that you can sell. And so I think the two will be complementary. I think you'll see carbon reuse go much more quickly. I think carbon reuse will stop being an EOR story, which is what it's been until now. And I think then people will
Enhanced
start
oil
to,
recovery.
yes, sorry, thank you for that. Yes,
Yeah.
to date, right? That's all that people have talked about when it comes to reuse. Now we're talking about making products from waste carbon. Very exciting next few years.
Is there any technologies you would point at that would give you that sort of sense of optimism, the exciting next few years, as you say, move away from, and even that alone, to be honest, carbon capture for enhanced oil recovery has would sort of, you would think could be more advanced, particularly in areas of the world like in the region where we are. We're still there's using of gas and water to maintain the enhanced oil recovery pressure in the oil reservoirs, CO2 less so. But is there any other areas where you would sort of draw that optimism from? Any other technologies that you would point towards?
Sure. I see a lot of work in areas like CO2 transformation, companies like 12, which are taking CO2 to CO. I also see a lot of work in hydrogen production and green hydrogen production and getting down the cost curve. I just saw a big announcement from Siemens Energy and Air Liquide on a project in Europe. The work that we do, if I may comment on that, right?
Please,
We're able to capture carbon monoxide, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide and convert it to products. We've made sustainable aviation fuel. We've made polyester for Zara dresses and Lululemon shorts, and so perfume for Coty. So I think there are a lot of technologies just getting to that commercial stage. And I think people just need to mentally get used to the fact that maybe their products will actually come from trash. And I think the other exciting thing I see is food. I'm starting to see people use CO2 as a feedstock to make protein. And I think that is really important because one, it is going to be a more sustainable way to make protein. And in addition, it is nutrition, because when you use bacteria to convert CO2 to make protein, you actually make 90% protein as opposed to 90% carbohydrates, which is often what is happening with the production of food. So I think that the runway for sustainable aviation fuel, food, and products from waste, including municipal solid waste, is going to really heat up in the next couple of years.
What about the financing, Jennifer? I mean, given there seems to be a lot of traditional investor capital available in the likes of Silicon Valley for communication startups, all of this sort of social media. Where are we at for the culture around things like you just mentioned, carbon to food, I mean, carbon to protein? Amazing concept, especially if it could, remove the need for too many cows.
Yeah, I think there's actually more investment than you think. There's two important things that have happened over the past few years. One is a realization that these tough tech, is what people call them, actually, they're not 5-year journeys. They're 15 to 20-year journeys. And so you're starting to see investors, the like of the Gates, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, make commitments to funds that are 20 years long rather than 10 years long. So that means they can invest in a startup company and work with it through commercialization and deployment. That was not true before. And so that's a very important point. The second thing is much more creative financing around climate tech, not just at the venture side, but there's also financing for scale up. And that's happening both at the government level and at the VC level, where instead of saying, well, I'm going to fund, when you're worth $10 million, they're saying we're going to fund, the $200 million commercial plan to help you really get across the valley of death, get across to where you can actually be operating at commercial scale, de-risk the technology. And then I said two things, but I'm going to go with three.
Three,
The other
absolutely.
thing, thanks. The other thing we're seeing is large corporates coming together to pay for carbon. Their willingness to pay for um, sustainable aviation fuel premiums, to pay for other premiums. And by coming together, they're catalyzing the carbon capture industry getting down the cost curve, a real willingness to help get it down the cost curve with these premiums like Stripe. You've seen them come together and invest in startups and invest in climate tech to reduce its cost.
Is the fact that I mean, are we seeing a lot of great ideas die because they're not getting across that valley as you describe it? Well, the idea that we're not getting that scale up capital, and so some really innovations are not making it to market. I mean, how costly is that lack of a bridge, if you like?
Well, I do consider that a big problem. I have seen great ideas die because they couldn't get financed to the next stage. I am increasingly optimistic, though, that there is a realization that two things need to happen. We can't go too fast and skip steps in these types of technologies. If you skip a step, you're gonna die because you're troubleshooting a very large piece of
Right.
equipment instead of a small one, right? So I'm seeing a realization: don't go too fast, and financing to support not going too fast. And then I'm seeing government-private partnerships to enable scale up. You see in the UK, the Department for Transport helping to finance building first of a kind, the European Commission through their Innovation Fund helping to finance first of a kind. They know the first big one will be very expensive and they're co-funding them. This is new. And I think this will reduce the number of failures that are simply due to not having enough financing to get to scale.
How important do you think it is that we get a price for carbon? We're seeing that repeatedly. It was a big center of discussion at Paris COP in 2015. It was a focus again last year in Glasgow. We still don't seem to be getting across this Rubicon of a price for carbon, and without it, so much seems to be on a slower pathway. Your thoughts on how important a carbon price is?
Well, I think it's quite important, to be honest. And if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, I would say we don't need it. We're getting it done, but we absolutely need it because it's the real difference now is we've realized we need to go faster, much, much faster, right? And so we can't afford 20, 40 years for technologies to really deploy. And the only way we're going to equalize them at the beginning is with a carbon price. I actually am also a firm believer of carbon prices that start higher and go down rather than down and go up. Because once you de-risk a technology, you don't need as big a carbon price, right? And so I think if we are not prepared to price carbon and other externalities, it's just going to be slower going because, companies need to make financial decisions, right? They're not charities. And so what you need to do is really get cost competitive. And I do think this is really important. And I would also say that the word tax scares everybody, but we already pay taxes for, you pay people to haul the trash for you. What is that? That's a tax because you're creating trash. And somehow we can't think of carbon in the same way as we do our trash.
Pulling our carbon away. Just finally, Jennifer, we have COP27 coming to the Middle East in Egypt this year, COP28 in the UAE next year. Two big hydrocarbon producers, oil and gas, particularly the UAE on oil, but big gas producer in Egypt. I'm wondering, what do you think that synergy, that opportunity presents? Because at COP26, of course, in Glasgow, the hydrocarbons industry wasn't even invited, wasn't even allowed in the door. Now they're going to be hosting it, more or less, you could say, given how the state owns those industries in Egypt and the UAE. Is that useful? Is that allow for something to happen that hasn't happened yet? Your thoughts on the outlook for COP27 and COP28 in the Middle East?
Well, frankly, at the end of the day, we need hydrocarbons and we need to make stuff. And whether we like it or not, all of our stuff, polyethylene, polyester, all of this has carbon and will always need carbon. And so if we can engage truly with the oil sector, the petro sector, they have so much of the infrastructure that could help accelerate this. And I think both the folks that are working on green technologies or alternatives to petroleum and the people working on the petroleum sector need to come together and accept that we need to go faster, and to go fast, we need to work together.
Well, we'll have to wrap it up there. Work together is the key on so many fronts. Collaborations and partnerships that never existed previously. Competitors putting aside and finding common ground is so critical in this sort of thesis of the 2-minute warning interview series that we are on today. That time is running out. Collaboration is key. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer Holmgren, CEO of Lanzatech, for joining us from the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean.